My girlfriend told our couple's therapist in front of me that she dated me as part of a self-help book she's writing about manipulating lonely people. Dr. Nina Kowalski's office had cream-colored walls and soft lighting designed to make difficult conversations feel safe. But nothing could have prepared me for what Sloane said when Dr. Kowalski asked her to explain why she'd been so distant lately. Sloane leaned back in the leather chair and crossed her legs, looking almost relieved to finally tell the truth. I've been distant because I'm finishing my book, the one I've been working on for the past 18 months. It's called The Loneliness Project, a social experiment in modern dating. The entire premise is that I can attract, manipulate, and control a lonely man using specific psychological techniques. Aaron is my case study. I've been documenting everything about our relationship from the beginning. Every conversation, every date, every vulnerability he's shared with me. It's all research for my book about how easy it is to exploit emotional desperation. Her voice was clinical, detached, like she was discussing a science experiment rather than the 15 months we'd spent together building what I thought was genuine love. Dr. Kowalski's pen stopped moving on her notepad, and she stared at Sloane with her mouth slightly open. I felt my entire body go numb, starting from my chest and spreading outward until I couldn't feel my hands gripping the armrests. Sloane noticed my reaction and smiled slightly. "Don't look so shocked, Aaron. You had to know something was off. Nobody develops feelings that quickly without being manipulated into it. I used specific techniques I researched, mirroring your interests, validating your insecurities, creating artificial intimacy through vulnerability sharing. It's all documented in my manuscript with timestamps and analysis of which manipulation tactics worked best." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through what appeared to be notes. Chapter 8 is entirely about you. How I identified you as an ideal subject. Divorced, isolated from friends, low self-esteem masked by professional success. You were perfect for demonstrating how lonely men are vulnerable to calculated emotional manipulation. Dr. Kowalski found her voice finally, and it came out sharp and horrified. "Ms. Laurent, what you're describing is psychological abuse and potentially illegal exploitation. You've been conducting an experiment on another human being without their consent or knowledge. This isn't therapy anymore. This is an admission of systematic deception and emotional manipulation." Sloane shrugged and continued scrolling through her phone. "It's not illegal. I never signed any consent forms or made false promises. Everything I did falls within normal dating behavior. I just did it with intention and documentation. The book explains how anyone can use these techniques. I'm actually providing a valuable service by exposing how easy it is to manipulate lonely people. Aaron should be grateful that I'm revealing this now, rather than after the book is published next year. My literary agent already has interest from 3 major publishers." She turned her phone screen toward Dr. Kowalski. "Want to see my chapter outline? I have detailed notes on every phase of the relationship." I found my voice finally, though it came out strangled and raw. "You said you loved me. You moved into my apartment. You met my family. You talked about our future together. All of that was fake? All of it was just material for your book?" Sloane put her phone down and looked at me directly for the first time since making her confession. "Not all of it was unpleasant. You're actually a decent person, which made the project easier. But yes, everything was calculated. The first 3 months were establishing trust and dependency. Months 4 through 9 were deepening emotional investment, while systematically isolating you from other relationships. The past 6 months have been maintaining the relationship while I finish writing and prepare for publication. I needed to see if the techniques could sustain a long-term relationship, not just create one. Turns out they can." She pulled a folder from her bag. "I brought a copy of my manuscript. The parts about you start on page 127. You're referred to as Subject A, but anyone who knows you will recognize the details. Your divorce, your relationship with your mother, your anxiety about being alone. It's all in there with analysis of how I exploited each vulnerability." Dr. Kowalski stood up abruptly. "I'm ending this session immediately. Ms. Laurent, What you've admitted to constitutes emotional abuse and potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. Mr. Brennan, I strongly recommend you speak with an attorney as soon as possible. If Ms. Laurent publishes this book with identifiable information about you without consent, that's a violation of your privacy and potentially defamatory. Sloane gathered her things, looking unconcerned. There's nothing illegal about writing a book about my own experiences. I changed identifying details. Subject A could be anyone. The publisher's lawyers already reviewed the manuscript for legal issues. I'm protected. She stood and walked toward the door without looking back at me. I'm moving out this weekend. Consider the relationship research complete. You can keep the furniture. I never cared about material things anyway. This was always about the book. The door closed behind Sloane, and I sat frozen in Dr. Kowalski's office, unable to process what had just happened. 15 months of my life that I'd thought were real had been a calculated psychological experiment for a stranger's career advancement. Dr. Kowalski moved her chair closer to mine, and her voice was gentle when she spoke. Aaron, I need you to listen to me carefully. What Sloane just admitted to is severe psychological abuse. The fact that she documented it doesn't make it research. It makes it premeditated manipulation. You need to take action immediately to protect yourself legally and emotionally. Do you have family or friends you can call? Someone who can be with you right now? I shook my head, because the truth was that over the past 15 months, Sloane had gradually convinced me to spend less time with my college friends, had discouraged me from staying close with my brother, had made comments about my coworkers being negative influences. I'd pulled away from everyone because Sloane said our relationship should be our priority. Now I understood that isolation had been part of her methodology, documented in Chapter 8 of her manuscript. I don't really have anyone close anymore, I said, my voice hollow. Dr. Kowalski pulled out her phone and made a call. I'm calling a colleague who specializes in trauma. You need immediate support. What Sloane described isn't a relationship ending. It's the revelation of sustained psychological abuse. I left Dr. Kowalski's office 2 hours later after meeting with Dr. Raymond Foster, a psychologist who specialized in trauma and manipulation. Dr. Foster had explained that what Sloane did constituted a form of psychological fraud and that the emotional damage could be severe and long-lasting. He'd given me resources for trauma therapy and the contact information for an attorney who handled privacy violations and emotional distress cases. I drove back to my apartment in a daze, my mind replaying every moment of the past 15 months, seeing them through the new lens of Sloane's confession. Our first date at the coffee shop, where she'd seemed so interested in my work as a software engineer. Our first kiss 3 weeks later when she'd said she felt an immediate connection. The weekend she'd moved into my apartment after 6 months, saying she wanted to build a life together. Every moment had been calculated, documented, analyzed for her book about manipulating lonely people. The betrayal felt so massive that I couldn't fully grasp it. My brain kept trying to find ways to make it make sense, but there was no making sense of someone who'd spent 15 months treating another human being as a research subject. When I got home, I found Sloane in the bedroom packing her clothes into suitcases. She didn't look up when I entered. I'll be done by tomorrow. I already found a sublet in Brooklyn. My agent is setting up meetings with publishers next week now that the manuscript is complete. This actually works out well timing-wise. The book ends with me revealing the experiment to the subject and analyzing his reaction. Your shock and hurt in Dr. Kowalski's office was perfect, very authentic. That'll make the final chapter really compelling. She folded a sweater and placed it carefully in her suitcase. I know you're upset, but try to see the bigger picture. This book is going to help people recognize manipulation tactics. You're contributing to something important, even if you don't realize it yet. I stood in the doorway, watching this stranger pack up her life from my apartment. Where's the manuscript? I want to read what you wrote about me." Sloane hesitated for the first time. "I don't think that's a good idea. It's written from a clinical perspective. It might be upsetting." I felt anger cutting through the shock. "You spent 15 months treating me like a lab rat. The least you can do is let me see what you wrote." Sloane pulled her laptop from her bag and opened a document. "Fine, but remember, this is written for an audience of people interested in psychology and manipulation techniques. It's not personal." She turned the screen toward me and I started reading. The document was 287 pages long. Chapter 8 was titled Case Study, Subject A, Exploiting Post-Divorce Vulnerability. I read the opening paragraph and felt sick. Subject A presented as an ideal candidate for demonstrating long-term manipulation sustainability. Male, 34, recent divorce, isolated social network, successful career masking deep insecurity about romantic worth. Initial approach was conducted at a location Subject A frequented, allowing me to manufacture a chance meeting. I spent 2 weeks observing his patterns before engineering our first interaction. His response to my interest was immediate and enthusiastic, confirming his desperate need for validation and connection. This desperation would become the foundation for all subsequent manipulation. The clinical detachment in Sloane's writing was chilling. I kept reading and found detailed descriptions of our conversations, analysis of my emotional responses, and notes about which manipulation techniques were most effective. One section detailed how Sloane had deliberately created insecurity about my relationships with friends to isolate me. Week 14, implemented isolation phase, made subtle comments suggesting Subject A's college friends were immature and holding him back from personal growth. Subject A immediately became defensive of friends, as predicted. Followed up with vulnerability sharing about my own experience, cutting off toxic friendships. This created cognitive dissonance, where Subject A began questioning friend relationships without direct instruction from me. By week 18, Subject A had significantly reduced contact with friends, attributing the change to his own growth rather than my influence. Isolation technique proved highly effective. I looked up from the laptop at Sloane, who was continuing to pack as if nothing unusual was happening. "You deliberately destroyed my friendships. You made me think I was making healthy choices when really you were isolating me, so I'd be more dependent on you." Sloane closed a suitcase and zipped it. "I documented what worked. That's the point of the book. To show people how manipulation happens so they can recognize it and protect themselves." I scrolled through more of the manuscript and found increasingly disturbing content. Sloane had documented intimate moments between us with clinical analysis of how she'd manufactured emotional connection. She'd written about my anxiety, my insecurities about my body, my fear of being alone, all framed as vulnerabilities she'd identified and exploited. One particularly horrifying section described how she'd researched my ex-wife's complaints about me during our divorce and deliberately behaved in opposite ways to make me believe Sloane was my perfect match. Subject A's previous marriage ended due to his wife's complaints about his emotional unavailability and work obsession. I positioned myself as understanding and supportive of his career, validating his work priorities while his ex-wife had criticized them. This created powerful contrast effect where Subject A perceived me as uniquely compatible. In reality, I had no genuine interest in his work. I simply mirrored appreciation for his career to exploit his residual hurt from divorce criticisms. The technique proved extremely effective at accelerating attachment. I felt violated reading this clinical dissection of my emotional wounds being weaponized against me. I took photos of the manuscript with my phone, capturing page after page of Sloane's documentation of her manipulation. She watched me do it, but didn't try to stop me. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Preserving evidence," I said. "You wrote a detailed confession of psychological abuse and fraud. You documented 15 months of systematic manipulation. You admitted to deliberately isolating me and exploiting my vulnerabilities. I'm taking this to a lawyer." Sloane laughed and shook her head. Good luck with that. Nothing I did was illegal. I never stole from you. I never physically hurt you. I just dated you strategically and wrote about it. That's protected by the First Amendment. My agent's lawyer already confirmed the book doesn't violate any laws. She picked up one of her packed suitcases. You're hurt and angry. I get it. But in a few months, you'll see this differently. Maybe you'll even be grateful that I'm exposing these manipulation techniques so other people don't fall for them. You're contributing to a larger social good. She carried her suitcase toward the door. I'll be back tomorrow for the rest of my things. After Sloane left, I sat on the couch and continued reading her manuscript on my phone from the photos I'd taken. The document got worse as I went deeper. Sloane had documented not just our relationship, but her entire methodology for identifying and targeting lonely people. Chapter 3 was titled, Identifying Ideal Subjects, Markers of Emotional Desperation. It listed specific traits to look for when selecting someone to manipulate. Recent divorce or breakup, small social circle, successful career with poor work-life balance, active on dating apps, defensive about being single, eager to please in conversations. I recognized myself in every criterion. Sloane had created a checklist for finding vulnerable people, and I'd checked every box. Chapter 5 detailed initial contact strategies, explaining how to manufacture chance meetings, mirror interests, and create false intimacy quickly. I remembered our first conversation at the coffee shop where Sloane had seemed so genuinely interested in my work. According to her manuscript, she'd researched my LinkedIn profile beforehand and prepared questions designed to make me feel understood and valued. Nothing about our meeting had been chance. She'd hunted me deliberately. The manuscript included a section on maintaining long-term manipulation that was particularly disturbing. Months 6 to 12 require careful balance between providing validation and introducing controlled uncertainty. Subject A responded well to intermittent reinforcement. I would be exceptionally attentive and affectionate for several days, then slightly distant for a day or two. This created anxiety in Subject A about relationship stability, making him work harder to maintain my approval. The technique prevented complacency and kept Subject A emotionally dependent. Each cycle of attention followed by withdrawal deepened his attachment while I remained emotionally detached, observing the results clinically. I remembered the periods when Sloane had seemed distant and how anxious I'd become, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. According to her manuscript, I'd done nothing wrong. She'd been deliberately creating insecurity as part of her experimental methodology. Every moment of anxiety, every time I'd tried harder to make her happy, had been a predictable response to calculated manipulation. Sloane had turned my emotions into data points for her book. I called the attorney Dr. Foster had recommended. Julian Beck's office was in Manhattan, and his assistant said he could see me the next morning. I spent that night awake, reading through all 287 pages of Sloane's manuscript, documenting the extent of her manipulation. The book concluded with a chapter titled Revelation and Results, where Sloane outlined her plan to reveal the experiment to me during couples therapy and analyze my reaction as the final data point for her research. She'd predicted I would experience shock, anger, betrayal, and self-doubt. She'd written detailed analysis of how these emotions would validate her thesis that lonely people could be manipulated systematically using her documented techniques. Reading her prediction of my emotional destruction, written weeks before she'd actually revealed the truth, made me understand the depth of her calculated cruelty. She hadn't just manipulated me. She'd planned every aspect of my psychological devastation and documented it for profit and professional advancement. This wasn't a relationship that ended badly. It was sustained psychological abuse disguised as research. The next morning, I met Julian Beck at his office. He was a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an air of controlled intensity. I explained what happened in Dr. Kowalski's office and showed him the photos of Sloane's manuscript. Julian read through the pages carefully, his expression growing darker with each section. Mr. Brennan, what Ms. Laurent did constitutes several potential legal violations. First, she's publishing private information about you without consent. Even if she uses a pseudonym for you, the details are specific enough that people who know you will recognize the story. That's a privacy violation. Second, she entered into a relationship under false pretenses with the intent to exploit you emotionally. That's fraud. Third, she documented intimate moments and conversations without your knowledge or consent for commercial purposes. Depending on your state's laws, that could be illegal recording or exploitation. He pulled out a notepad. Tell me everything about your relationship with Ms. Laurent. When you met, how it developed, when you started noticing changes in your social connections, everything. We're building a case for fraud, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I spent 3 hours with Julian, detailing my relationship with Sloane from our first meeting to her confession in therapy. Julian took meticulous notes and asked detailed questions about how Sloane had isolated me from friends and family, how she'd exploited specific vulnerabilities, and what financial or other resources I'd spent on the relationship. I explained that Sloane had moved into my apartment rent-free for 9 months, that I'd paid for most of our dates and trips, and that I'd taken time off work for a vacation she'd planned that, according to her manuscript, was Phase 3, creating shared memory events to deepen subject dependency. Julian documented everything. Ms. Laurent received substantial financial benefit from this relationship under false pretenses. You supported her while she lived rent-free in your apartment and wrote a book exploiting your emotional vulnerability. That strengthens the fraud claims significantly. He pulled up a document on his computer. I'm going to send a cease and desist letter to Ms. Laurent and her literary agent demanding they halt publication plans immediately. We'll also file a lawsuit for fraud, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The manuscript itself is evidence of premeditated psychological abuse. Julian sent the cease and desist letter that afternoon to both Sloane and her literary agent, Veronica Tang. The letter outlined the legal claims against Sloane and demanded that all publication plans be suspended pending resolution of the case. It also demanded that Sloane provide a complete copy of her manuscript and all research materials related to her experiment on me. 2 days later, Julian received a response from an attorney representing Sloane. The letter denied all allegations and claimed that Sloane's manuscript was protected speech under the First Amendment. It stated that Sloane had changed identifying details to protect privacy and that any similarities to real people were coincidental. The letter threatened a countersuit for harassment if we continued pursuing legal action. Julian read the response and smiled grimly. This is exactly what I expected. They're trying to intimidate you into dropping the case. But they made a mistake. The manuscript you photographed specifically identifies you by detailed personal information. There's no way they can claim the details are coincidental when Sloane admitted in front of a therapist that you're the subject. We're moving forward with the lawsuit. Julian filed the complaint in New York State Supreme Court 3 weeks after Sloane's confession. The lawsuit named Sloane Laurent and her literary agent Veronica Tang as defendants. It alleged fraud, invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and unjust enrichment. The complaint detailed Sloane's admission in therapy, included excerpts from her manuscript, and outlined the systematic manipulation she'd documented. Julian also filed a motion for a preliminary injunction to prevent publication of the book until the case was resolved. The lawsuit and injunction motion made news in publishing industry circles. A writer being sued by their research subject for fraud and emotional distress was unusual enough to generate attention. Several literary blogs picked up the story, and suddenly Sloane's project was public knowledge. Her literary agent, Veronica Tang, released a statement defending Sloan and calling the lawsuit an attack on creative freedom and journalistic inquiry. Ms. Meyer-Laurent's book is an important exploration of manipulation and vulnerability in modern dating. The legal action against her is an attempt to silence her voice and prevent critical social commentary. We stand behind Ms. Laurent and will vigorously defend her right to publish. The publicity generated more problems for Sloan than support. Several writers and ethicists began questioning whether what Sloan described constituted research or abuse. A prominent psychology professor at Columbia published an op-ed arguing that Sloan's social experiment violated basic research ethics by lacking informed consent, institutional review board oversight, and participant protection. The professor pointed out that academic researchers couldn't conduct psychological experiments on unwitting subjects without ethical violations, and calling it a book project didn't change the ethical problems. Other writers criticized Sloan for exploiting another person's vulnerability for profit, arguing that documenting manipulation didn't justify engaging in manipulation. The controversy grew as more details about the case became public. Support for Sloan's project began to erode as people read excerpts from her manuscript showing the calculated cruelty of her actions. Comments on literary blogs and social media turned increasingly critical. This isn't journalism. This is abuse documented for profit. She destroyed a real person for a book deal. Would we defend this if the genders were reversed? Sloan's publishers started backing away. All three companies that had expressed interest in acquiring her manuscript quietly withdrew their offers. Veronica Tang tried to spin the controversy as proof the book was too provocative and important, but publishers didn't want the legal liability or public relations nightmare of releasing a book that was the subject of an active fraud lawsuit. Without publisher interest, Veronica Tang dropped Sloan as a client. In a statement to industry publications, Tang said she was ending representation due to creative differences and concerns about legal exposure. The statement was professional, but everyone understood what it meant. Sloan's book project had become toxic, and her agent didn't want to be associated with it. Sloan responded by hiring a new lawyer and doubling down on her defense. She gave an interview to a literary magazine arguing that her book was misunderstood and that she was being persecuted for exposing uncomfortable truths about human vulnerability. People don't want to face how easy they are to manipulate. They're attacking me because I'm holding up a mirror to their own susceptibility. My book would have helped people recognize these tactics and protect themselves. The interview backfired spectacularly. Sloan came across as cold and narcissistic, showing no remorse for the harm she'd caused. She described me as Subject A, who provided valuable data without any acknowledgement that I was a real person who'd been hurt by her actions. The interview's comment section filled with people expressing disgust at Sloan's lack of empathy. Several mental health professionals commented that Sloan's behavior and justifications showed classic signs of antisocial personality traits. One therapist wrote, "The complete lack of empathy, the instrumental use of other people, the manipulation documented without remorse. This isn't research. This is a textbook case of psychological abuse by someone with serious empathy deficits." The professional criticism damaged Sloan's credibility further. She'd positioned herself as a social commentator exposing manipulation, but mental health professionals were identifying her as the manipulative abuser in the scenario. The narrative Sloan had tried to construct about being a brave truth-teller collapsed, as people understood she wasn't exposing manipulation, she was engaging in it. Discovery phase of the lawsuit began 4 months after filing. Julian subpoenaed Sloan's complete manuscript, all research notes, emails with her literary agent, and any other documents related to her book project. Sloan's lawyer tried to fight the subpoenas, claiming author work product privilege, but Judge Lawrence Whitman ruled that the materials were relevant to the fraud and emotional distress claims and ordered Sloane to produce everything. The documents revealed even more disturbing details. Sloane had kept detailed journals beyond what was in her manuscript. She'd documented our most intimate conversations, including things I'd shared about childhood trauma, my difficult relationship with my father, and my fears about never finding lasting love. She'd analyzed every vulnerability I'd revealed to her as potential material for her book. One journal entry from month 7 of our relationship read, "Subject A, disclosed childhood neglect trauma tonight. Extremely valuable material for chapter on exploiting attachment wounds. Used empathetic mirroring to encourage deeper disclosure. Subject A is becoming increasingly dependent on me as primary emotional support. Isolation techniques from earlier chapters proving effective. Will continue documenting trauma responses." The journal entries also revealed that Sloane had shared her project with friends while it was ongoing. Several emails to a friend named Claire discussed the social experiment, with mocking commentary about my emotional investment in the relationship. One email read, "Aaron actually told me tonight that he thinks I'm his soulmate. It's almost too easy. I've been implementing the techniques for 9 months, and he's completely bought into the manufactured connection. I'm getting such good material for the book. Chapter 12 is going to be incredible. I'm documenting how sustained manipulation can make someone believe they've found their perfect match, when really they're just responding to calculated vulnerability exploitation. He has no idea any of this is fake. It's fascinating watching him construct this whole narrative of our destined relationship." Reading these emails was devastating. Not only had Sloane manipulated me, she'd mocked my genuine emotions with her friends while it was happening. The betrayal went deeper than I'd imagined. She'd turned my love into a joke and entertainment for her social circle. Julian used the emails and journal entries to strengthen our case. He filed an amended complaint adding defamation claims based on Sloane's disparaging characterizations of me in communications with third parties. He also added a claim for fraud based on evidence that Sloane had explicitly planned to live rent-free in my apartment as part of her research methodology. One email to her agent, Veronica Tang, from month 6, discussed moving into Subject A's apartment to reduce my expenses while finishing the manuscript. He's offered several times, and I'm going to accept. It'll give me better access to document his daily patterns, and it'll save me about $800 per month in rent. The financial benefit also adds an interesting dimension to the research. I'm literally being paid to conduct this experiment through his support. The email provided clear evidence that Sloane had planned to financially benefit from the relationship under false pretenses. That elevated the case from just emotional distress to concrete fraud with measurable damages. Sloane's deposition took place in Julian's conference room on a morning 6 months after her initial confession. I was allowed to attend. Sloane walked in wearing business attire and looking composed, though I could see tension in her shoulders. Her lawyer sat beside her. Julian started with basic questions establishing her identity and relationship to me, then moved to the core issues. "Ms. Laurent, did you enter into a romantic relationship with Aaron Brennan with the intent of using him as a research subject for your book?" Sloane glanced at her lawyer before answering. "I entered into a relationship with Mr. Brennan and also documented the relationship for my book project. The two things weren't mutually exclusive." Julian pulled out her manuscript. "This is your manuscript, correct? The one titled The Loneliness Project, a Social Experiment in Modern Dating?" Sloane nodded. "Yes, that's my manuscript." Julian opened to the introduction. "Please read the first paragraph of your introduction for the record." Sloane read in a flat voice. "This book documents a 15-month social experiment in which I deliberately initiated and maintained a romantic relationship with a lonely, vulnerable man for the purpose of studying manipulation techniques in modern dating." The subject, referred to throughout as Subject A, was unaware he was part of a research project. This lack of informed consent was necessary to ensure authentic responses and prevent observation bias. Everything about the relationship was calculated and documented, from our first meeting to my planned revelation of the experiment during couples therapy. This book provides unprecedented insight into how easy it is to manipulate lonely people using specific psychological techniques. Julian let the words hang in the air. Ms. Laurent, you just read that you initiated a relationship with Mr. Brennan specifically for research purposes without his knowledge or consent. Is that accurate? Sloane's lawyer put his hand on her arm and leaned over to whisper, but Sloane pulled away. Yes, that's accurate. The entire point of the project was to demonstrate manipulation techniques. Informed consent would have defeated the purpose. Julian continued questioning, getting Sloane to confirm details from her manuscript and journal entries. She admitted to deliberately isolating me from friends, exploiting my vulnerabilities about my divorce, and calculating every aspect of our relationship for her book. She confirmed she'd lived rent-free in my apartment for 9 months while completing her manuscript, saving approximately $1,600 in rent. She acknowledged that she'd never felt genuine romantic feelings for me and had manufactured emotional intimacy through manipulation techniques she'd researched. The admissions kept coming, each one more damaging than the last. Julian asked about the emails where she'd mocked me to friends. Ms. Laurent, in an email to Claire Prescott dated 14 months ago, you wrote, Aaron is completely bought into the manufactured connection. He has no idea any of this is fake. Did you write that? Sloane nodded. Yes, I was updating Claire on the project's progress. Julian's voice was hard. You were mocking Mr. Brennan's genuine emotions while manipulating him. That's what you were doing, correct? Sloane's composure cracked slightly. I was documenting my observations. The deposition lasted 4 hours. By the end, Sloane had confirmed every element of our fraud and emotional distress claims. She'd admitted to deliberate deception, financial exploitation, and calculated psychological manipulation. She'd acknowledged that her actions had no legitimate research purpose and were simply a book project. She'd even admitted she understood her actions would cause me emotional harm when I discovered the truth, but she'd proceeded anyway because the revelation chapter was important for her manuscript. Julian had gotten everything we needed on the record. After the deposition, he called me with an update. Aaron, that was one of the most successful depositions I've conducted. Sloane essentially confessed to everything we alleged. Her lawyer was trying to get her to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights, but she was too arrogant to stop answering questions. She still believes she did nothing wrong. That's going to destroy her in court. He paused. I expect we'll receive a settlement offer soon. Sloane's lawyer knows they'll lose at trial with her own admissions on the record. The settlement offer came 2 weeks later. Sloane's lawyer proposed that Sloane would pay $75,000 in damages, agreed never to publish any book or article containing identifiable information about me, and provide a written apology acknowledging her fraud and manipulation. Julian thought the offer was too low. We're going to counter with $250,000 in damages, complete destruction of her manuscript and research materials, a public apology, and an agreement that she'll submit to professional psychological evaluation. Your case has generated enough publicity that we have leverage. Sloane's reputation is destroyed. Publishers won't touch her. Her literary career is over. She needs to settle to avoid a trial that will make things even worse for her. Julian sent the counteroffer the next day. Sloane's lawyer rejected it immediately, saying Sloane couldn't afford $250,000 and that demanding destruction of her manuscript was censorship. He offered to increase damages to $100,000, but insisted the manuscript provisions were non-negotiable. Julian responded that we'd see them in court. The trial was scheduled for 8 months after Sloane's confession. The case had generated enough media attention that the courtroom was full of observers and reporters when we arrived. Julian had prepared extensively, organizing our evidence into a compelling narrative. He called Dr. Kowalski as the first witness. She testified about the couple's therapy session where Sloane had revealed her deception, describing Sloane's clinical detachment and my visible shock. Mr. Brennan was completely blindsided. Ms. Laurent showed no empathy or remorse. She discussed him as a research subject, not a person she'd been in a relationship with. I've been a therapist for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. It was chilling. Julian introduced Sloane's manuscript into evidence, walking Dr. Kowalski through key sections. She testified that the manipulation techniques Sloane described were forms of psychological abuse. Creating artificial intimacy through calculated vulnerability sharing, deliberately isolating someone from their support network, exploiting known trauma wounds. These are tactics abusers use. Ms. Laurent documented sustained psychological abuse and framed it as research. Julian called Dr. Raymond Foster next. He testified as an expert on psychological manipulation and trauma. He'd reviewed Sloane's manuscript and interviewed me extensively about the relationship. Mr. Brennan experienced what we call betrayal trauma. He believed he was in a loving, mutual relationship when in reality he was being systematically exploited. That cognitive dissonance causes severe psychological distress. Ms. Laurent's documented manipulation meets clinical criteria for psychological abuse. The fact that she planned it in advance and documented it for profit makes it more severe, not less. This wasn't a relationship that went bad. It was a calculated campaign of deception that was designed from the beginning to harm Mr. Brennan when the truth was revealed. Dr. Foster explained how the techniques Sloane used, isolation, intermittent reinforcement, exploitation of vulnerabilities, were classic abuse tactics. He testified that my ongoing anxiety, trust issues, and depression were direct results of Sloane's sustained manipulation. Julian asked if Sloane's claims about providing a social benefit had merit. Dr. Foster was unequivocal. Documenting abuse doesn't make it research. Ms. Laurent didn't study manipulation. She engaged in manipulation for personal and financial gain. I testified about my relationship with Sloane, describing how we'd met, how quickly I'd fallen in love, and how she'd gradually isolated me from friends and family. I explained how devastated I'd been by her confession in therapy and how betrayed I felt reading her manuscript. Julian asked me to describe the financial support I'd provided during the relationship. I detailed the $1,600 in rent Sloane had saved by living with me, the approximately $8,000 I'd spent on dates and trips, and the emotional support I'd provided while she finished her book that was actually about manipulating me. Julian asked how Sloane's actions had affected my life. I don't trust anyone anymore. I question every social interaction, wondering if people have ulterior motives. I've had panic attacks. I've needed therapy 3 times a week. I can't imagine dating again because I don't know how to tell if someone's being genuine. She didn't just break my heart, she destroyed my ability to trust my own judgment about people. That's what 15 months of documented manipulation does. Sloane testified in her own defense, and it was a disaster. Her lawyer tried to coach her to show remorse. But Sloane couldn't help defending her project. She insisted her book would have helped people recognize manipulation, that my emotional reaction proved her thesis about vulnerability, and that she'd done nothing illegal. She claimed the relationship was mutually beneficial because I'd gotten companionship and she'd gotten research material. Julian destroyed her on cross-examination. He walked her through her manuscript page by page, reading aloud the clinical descriptions of exploiting my vulnerabilities. He showed her the emails mocking me to friends. He confronted her with journal entries detailing how she'd deliberately made me anxious to deepen my dependency. With each piece of evidence, Sloane's defense crumbled. She tried to maintain that it was just research, but Julian made clear it was abuse. Ms. Laurent, you identified a recently divorced, lonely man. You researched his vulnerabilities. You deliberately created false intimacy. You isolated him from friends. You exploited his trauma for material. You lived rent-free in his apartment while finishing a book about manipulating him. And you planned from the beginning to devastate him by revealing it was all fake. That's not research. That's sadism with documentation. Correct? Sloane's face flushed. I was studying human behavior. That has value. Julian pulled out her email to Veronica Tang about saving money by moving into my apartment. You were exploiting another person for financial gain and career advancement. That's fraud, Miss Laurent, not research. The jury watched Sloane's testimony with visible disgust. Several jurors shook their heads when she defended her actions. The trial lasted 5 days. Julian presented overwhelming evidence of Sloane's fraud, manipulation, and calculated cruelty. Her defense was weak, relying on First Amendment arguments that didn't apply because the fraud had occurred before any publication attempt. Sloane's lawyer argued that writing about personal experiences was protected speech, but Julian demonstrated that the fraud wasn't the writing, it was the deceptive relationship itself. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and unjust enrichment. The jury awarded me $180,000 in compensatory damages and $400,000 in punitive damages. Judge Whitman also issued an injunction permanently barring Sloane from publishing any book or article containing identifiable information about me without my written consent. The verdict made headlines. Writer ordered to pay $580K for manipulating man as book research. The case became a cautionary tale about ethics in creative nonfiction and the limits of using real people as material without consent. Legal experts pointed out that the case established precedent for holding writers accountable when their research methods involved fraud and emotional manipulation. Publishing industry organizations issued statements about the importance of ethical boundaries in narrative nonfiction. Sloane attempted to appeal the verdict, but the appellate court upheld the jury's decision, finding overwhelming evidence of fraud and manipulation. Sloane's legal and professional reputation was destroyed. She'd lost her literary agent, her book deal, and now owed me over $500,000 in damages. She filed for bankruptcy, trying to discharge the judgment, but Julian argued successfully that debts arising from fraud and intentional harm couldn't be discharged. The judgment would follow Sloane indefinitely. She'd have to pay through wage garnishments and asset seizures for years. Her career as a writer was over before it started. I used the settlement money to pay for therapy, rebuild my life, and eventually relocate to a different city for a fresh start. Dr. Foster worked with me for over a year, helping me process the betrayal and develop healthier relationship patterns. The healing was slow. I had to learn to trust people again, to accept that not everyone had hidden agendas, and to recognize genuine connection versus manipulation. It took 2 years before I felt ready to date again. When I did, I was careful and methodical, watching for red flags and maintaining boundaries. I met someone eventually, a woman named Rachel who worked as a teacher and had her own experience with a manipulative ex. We understood each other's caution and built trust slowly. 3 years after Sloane's confession, Rachel and I got married. The ceremony was small, just close friends and family. Standing at the altar, I realized Sloane's cruelty hadn't permanently broken me. I'd survived psychological abuse, fought for accountability, and rebuilt my life. Sloane had tried to reduce me to a case study in manipulation, but I'd proven I was more than a victim in someone else's story. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.